Hello and a very warm welcome to the Real Talk, yet another edition that I hope will leave you all inspired and enlightened. I recently had the pleasure of being part of a forum that brought together governance experts from across the continent, and the very interesting points that came out of that meeting regarding governance issues in Africa. And I thought, why not have a conversation with one of the people in the know? Hence this conversation today with the coordinator of governance and peace building at the UNDP Regional Service Center for Africa. Let's meet our guest. Thank you so much for joining us on the program. We are at Mythos Boutique Hotel in Kiyovu. You should check on them whenever you find time. Our guest, Nirina Kiplagat, is the Governance and Peace Building Coordinator at the UNDP Regional Service Center for Africa, based in Addis Ababa. Nirina, thank you for honoring our invitation.
Thank you for having me.
How are you doing?
I'm very well, thanks, Jackie. How are you?
Very well, thanks. How's the Kigali stay so far?
It's been great. We're very grateful to our hosts for hosting us for this community of practice meeting with governance and peace building experts, practitioners, advisors from our UNDP country offices across Africa.
And you do this annually?
We do.
Now, before we get deep into that professional side of you, let's go back to where it all started. Tell us a little bit about yourself, an early context that will help us understand why you are where you are today. So where were you born? What kind of family were you raised in?
I was born in Nairobi. I'm a Kenyan national. I'm Kenyan and Malagasy.
Okay.
Grew up predominantly in Nairobi, and but my father was a diplomat, so also when I was very young we lived abroad. But I would say spending formative years in Kenya and seeing the context around us. At the time there were a lot of conflicts. We had Somalia, Sudan, then as you know, one country, Uganda. And my father was very much involved in peace and mediation. And as a family, one of the traditions is we always have dinner together. And he would always share what was happening in his day. So I was always aware of the dynamics, aware of the peace processes, aware of his own experiences, sometimes quite precarious, going into the bush to meet with a rebel leader, or you know, but I did not intentionally set out to focus on conflict prevention and peace building, which is what my master's degree is in. But I can say that definitely being aware of these, you know, dynamics and seeing, you know, what could be done, and seeing people who had a sense of vocation. It was not a job. It was very much a vocation of doing what you can within certain situations.
You know, I was such a great admirer of your father.
Thank you very much.
Oh yes, may God rest his soul. He was an amazing man, calm, peaceful, composed, you know. And then your mom, walking side by side. A woman that I'd known all my life as a girl guide, the chairperson of the association. She was involved in the Scouts and Girl Guide affairs. These are two prominent people in the country. How was their parenting? How did they, what are sort of the values that they instilled in you? What did they tell you about life, about treating people, about, you know, setting out on your own? What sort of encouragement came from them? I'm looking for the influence that they had. As you said, these were not people who were just working daily jobs. They were serving a calling.
A calling is the right word, and I would say my parents both had a profound influence on myself and my siblings in the way that we were raised. Very much grounded on values and integrity. Do what you love, you know, as I said, really the element of vocation. Give something your all. But one phrase which comes to mind is my father liked to say, every encounter is sacred. And you never know what comes out of meeting somebody. So he had an open door policy always. I've heard many anecdotes, particularly after he passed, of people who went to see him when he was permanent secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And he was known to meet with everyone who came to his office. He never turned anybody away. And one of the people who came to see him actually led to our engagement, you can say as Kenya, in the Mozambique peace process. So there was a man who came to see him, and what was interesting, many years later, I saw in Our Daily Bread, which is a daily, Christian reading.
Christian, yes.
This story was actually captured, entitled Remember John, and talking about this encounter of this man coming to my father's office, and really sharing the complexities of the Mozambique conflict. A lot of the neighboring countries were engaged directly in the conflict, and so really seeing, is there a way perhaps that Kenya could be involved as more of a neutral type of country. And that, in a way, was the first encounter that led to a number of different actions.
That is amazing. I'm imagining if he was, had he been the busy type, how people in such public offices will be busy full time, then that could have been a lost opportunity. It could have been a lost opportunity.
I think he was very busy. But he
wasn't busy for people. Yeah, he made time.
He always made time. And, also for ourselves, as I said, it was the principle. Dinner is together. Yeah. We all share what happened during, the day. But there were certain, certain principles which he held dear. Someone who was also very disciplined in life. So I would say also those values are those that we, have also carried.
When it came to a career choice, early on as you're thinking of going to college, what were you keen on?
I was initially going to do fine art. I love art. I have a passion for it. As I was exploring, I started to have my doubts, and my parents said, pick a subject which you're passionate about. So I picked history. So my undergraduate degree is in history and social cultural anthropology. And I'm a big believer in the importance of also understanding the past in order to better understand the present. So having more of this contextualized perspective, I think, is extremely important, in the work that I do as well. I then did an internship at the Carter Center in their conflict resolution program, which was extremely interesting. And it was also through, this experience, really seeing that a lot of the skills can be used in different contexts. When you're looking at mediation, if you're looking at active listening, a lot of these are not just important at the interstate level, and in those days there were more interstate type of conflicts than intrastate, but even in terms of interpersonal relationships, intercommunal, and the applicability I found extremely interesting. And as I said, with the backdrop of, knowing sort of these conflict dynamics, and in a way having a first-hand account, from my father from within the region, was when I made the decision to then do my master's degree in conflict analysis and resolution. So that was a bit of the academic journey in the beginning.
Wow. I'm looking at it with a lot of admiration, quite a journey. So let's look at your role today as the Governance and Peacebuilding Coordinator, and based at the Regional Service Center for Africa. What does that service center do? What does your job entail? And if there are any challenges that you encounter in trying to execute your role, share that with us and how you've overcome them.
At the regional level, as I started off by saying earlier, a big part of our work is support to the country offices within the region. So we serve 46 country offices. We provide technical support, accompaniment. This is a big part of our work. We are also a bit of a bridge between the headquarters and the country offices. As a regional office, we engage with the African Union quite a lot, the Regional economic, communities, identify priority areas that we work together on. We also develop regional projects through which, and as I highlighted, we now have more, I would say, sub-regional or multi-country projects that deal with complex challenges. So, for example, prevention and response, to violent extremism. We have a framework, so it goes a bit back to what you were saying of having some accountability, from one meeting to the next. So we have a renewed governance and peace building framework for Africa, which we are currently implementing. This is the last year, which is also why we're reflecting on
how long has it been running?
From 2022 to 2025. So it aligns with the UNDP strategic plan and UNDP's Africa Promise. So under that, we have particular areas. So under governance and peace building, through a highly consultative approach, also looking at current analysis in 2022, although it is a flexible framework, we are implementing 6 pillars. So these range from prevention and early action, where we're looking at implementing prevention agendas, which, for example, have been highlighted in a new agenda for peace. So this is the work on support to capacities for peace within a country, inside mediators. We're also working on elements of climate security, rule of law, human rights, business and human rights as an emerging, issue, support to elections, so civic participation. So there are a number of core areas, and then of course working in the Africa region and noting the youth demographic, we have also a lot of focus and prioritization of youth in our work. So both as a standalone pillar, I can say, of focus in terms of looking at enabling legislation, what sort of opportunities to provide to youth for economic empowerment, for leadership, but also looking at engagement of youth across all of the areas of our work. At the regional level, I would say we also look at what are emerging issues which we need to work on. So also a bit of thought leadership, developing knowledge products, doing advocacy on key issues of concern. So the work is quite broad.
It is.
There are multitude, of challenges, but in different categories, I would say. And there are some contextual challenges, within the region that we work, emerging issues, say, with climate change, which we're seeing. And when we look at climate security, we look at, how is climate change a threat multiplier, but how do we better prepare in terms of dealing with the potential conflicts that might arise, for example.
The people really look at climate change from that angle.
Yes.
Where do they meet? Climate change and security? It's interesting that you should mention it. Yeah.
So not a direct correlation,
Okay.
but which is important to emphasize. But when we look at the effects of climate change, and then we see that it is a threat multiplier that can lead to different effects, and one of these can potentially be conflict. So
How would it come by?
for example, if, let's say, reduced resources, when you have then more competition over natural resources, be it water, grazing, ground, also movement of people, outside of, let's say, traditional areas of, let's say, pastoralist activity. So looking at these different types of trends, then how does one, better prepare? Yeah. When we look at some other challenges, we see that currently our continent is the most affected by violent extremism globally, and we're seeing a bit of, a spread there. So there's been also, unconstitutional changes of government, particularly, in West Africa. How do we, support
How do you
these
handle
countries?
that? Yeah.
So quite, a multitude of contextual challenges. Organizationally, I'd say that there has also been questioning of the multilateral system, which of course, affects us. And we're also seeing a reduction in funding, which is, a concern. Yeah. So, these are some of the challenges, but I would say, as UNDP, quite proactive, and this is also not just at the level of the regional service center, but I would say UNDP as a whole, in terms of looking at how do we deal with some of these broader challenges that we're experiencing.
The issue of funding,
yes,
that would be key, and because it's the trending issue at the moment.
Yes.
In a scenario where your funding has reduced, and indeed without that, then you're not going to help the governments that you want to help or support the communities that you'd support. What other potential sources of funding would you be looking at?
There has always been a quest, I would say, in terms of looking at alternative funding sources. We also have government cost sharing. As UNDP, we work very closely with government and national partners. There are also certain areas of work which we're developing a lot more, such as economic governance, and also working with governments on improving, I can call it, fiscal health. So, looking at domestic revenue as well, different sources, stronger engagement, with private sector. In the past few years in the Africa region, we've also been working very closely with the Africa Development Bank. So, there are these different areas, that have been explored, and we are continuing, to explore to better serve the countries we're in.
Yeah, thank you. We will be back in just a bit. What I would love to know from you when we come back is how African countries can invest in empowering women and young people in order to ensure effective and responsive leadership. If the wars and the conflicts in Africa are mainly being caused by men, how do we make sure we have women and young people, okay, both men and women, trying to calm down the egos of the older generation? Okay, I'll not ask that question as it is. We will be back. This is The Real Talk. Thank you so much for joining us. Today we're talking about governance, and it's such a pleasure to have Nirina Kiplagat with us. Please share the link to this conversation. We're live both on TV and on the YouTube channel. If you're studying governance or international relations and diplomacy, this is your conversation. My name is Jackie. We are at Mythos Boutique in Kiyovu. Please visit them on their social media pages and their website as well. We'll be back. Welcome back to The Real Talk. It is always a pleasure to see you. And if you feel like this conversation should reach someone who currently is not watching, please share the link on your different platforms that we have as many people as possible benefit from this conversation. I am talking to the Governance and Peacebuilding Coordinator at the UNDP Regional Service Center for Africa, based out of Addis Ababa, and we'll talk about the different governance issues. I do hope that you'll get to learn a thing or two from this conversation. Nirina, I wanted to ask about inequalities. We've got rising inequalities. This is a global phenomenon, but let's look at Africa. How can our African countries invest in empowering women and young people in order to ensure responsive leadership? We're falling short. How can we make use of these demographics in order to change things or improve things? And are there examples of best practices that we can learn from?
First, I would say it's important to have an enabling environment. And, when we look in legislation or even in constitutions, which give, for example, a gender ratio, that, there are special seats in parliament or opportunities for youth to run, in politics. For example, in Nigeria, they're not too young to run. So looking at these different enablers, first at policy level. Beyond that, quite pragmatically, it's really important to focus on development of leaders, having leadership training opportunities and also mentorship. So there are examples, for example, where there's support to training of aspirants, preparing them, so engaging with political parties, engaging with aspirants who are specifically women, youth, also people with disabilities, and preparing them better to be able to compete also within the political party and to also, run for office. I would say separate, to that, there is a lot of focus also on mentorship. When we have projects that, focus on, let's say, livelihoods, empowerment, they're often coupled with leadership training and mentorship. So more of an accompaniment type of process. And these are projects which we certainly prioritize in the Africa region, and to really then cultivate also the current and future, I'd say, leadership potential on the continent. This year is an important year for youth. 2025 marks the 10th anniversary of the Youth Peace and Security Agenda, so Security Council Resolution 2250. So as we're marking this anniversary, we're also looking at how effective has it been in the past, 10 years in terms of implementation. The process at the UN side in terms of doing the review is being led by the Peacebuilding Support Office, but of course in collaboration with other agencies, UNDP being one of them. So we actually held a dialogue on the sidelines of the African Union Summit this year to gather perspectives from the Africa region. And from this report, again, we can see where are the challenges for youth engagement in peace and security, where are the opportunities. And one of the areas which we support is, for example, developing youth peace and security action plans. So again, starting from the point of having an enabler and then being able to do work also at different levels. So through this process also, we can see where do we need to further invest or support.
Today Rwanda is home to the Africa School of Governance.
Yes.
And with everything that you've said, would need an enlightened leadership looking forward as you try to see how the youth have benefited in the last 10 years. I wonder, what value, in your opinion, what value does it bring to the continent having a school of governance? Because this is new to us. We don't have it. In East Africa, people would just come out of some place and they're in government. They're making decisions that will affect millions of people in their country with little education as far as governance is concerned. If you can just tell us, why is it of value for Rwanda today to have that school that is not going to serve Rwanda but the continent?
This is something which we have also supported, and at the regional level, we previously had a project on looking at African Union treaties, ratification and implementation. And in the 5 countries in which we were implementing this project, one of the components that then was implemented as time went on was developing curricula on civic education at very young age, the beginning of primary school, and relevant curricula adapted across. So just that awareness, which is very important. I think there has been a recognition of the importance of leadership. As UNDP, we have been working on collaborative leadership for elected officials or transformational leadership. So having a school of governance, I think, is very important, for the region, and really being able to cultivate, promote, support. I think also being quite deliberate again on the mentorship, components, which are important, for leaders who sometimes also feel a little bit isolated. I've worked on a few collaborative leadership, projects, and it's interesting to also hear from leaders themselves. What are
We
some
say
of
a
the
lot of things about
challenges?
them.
Indeed.
Yeah.
But for them to be
listen
in
to
a
them.
safe space, also to share, and to have also these, tailor-made types of projects. So also at the regional level, we have recently started a regional leadership program. But as mentioned, I think this is very good, for the region overall, having an Africa School, of governance that is there, and quite intentionally, trying to groom and support, more of these leadership capacities.
We live in a time when, my God, there's conflict from one corner of Africa to the other corner of Africa, and not just Africa, but even globally. With these challenges and multilateralism, as you mentioned earlier, if your father were alive today and you're having a conversation with him, picture you at the dinner table with him, what would that conversation sound like?
One thing which I really appreciated about my father is he had such a depth of knowledge on a variety of topics, of issues, and he believed in having an informed, having an informed stance. So he was a voracious reader, talked, to many people, and so he had, and had worked on the continent also, in different roles and capacities. So conversations with him were extremely interesting because they were quite atypical, because of the different angles he would approach a subject. One thing which I would also say, and maybe this comes from his deep Christian faith, is he was someone who always had hope, always. He was someone who did not believe that anything was impossible. And I believe with, these elements that he had within him, there was always an opportunity. It was always worth trying to be able to engage. He is known, a lot for the peace work that he did, particularly, well, when he was in government. Those are probably more known, but he was previously in the National Council of Churches of Kenya. He worked with the youth wing of the World Council of Churches in the 60s. Later, when he retired, also as an individual, be it an independent consultant, he had Africa Peace Forum, but he always worked on peace wherever he was. And this is what I mean, that it really was a vocation. So a conversation with him, I would say, would have been offering insights into the complexities of a conflict, unpacking it in a way which would have been unique, I'm sure. Because he often surprised people, with the way, he did his, his analysis.
Yeah. He wouldn't stop on the surface.
No, he was very, and, would bring out things that, perhaps had not really been, been thought of.
Yes.
But he was also very inclusive. And, for really, when we look at successful peace processes, they are very, it's important to have an element of inclusion.
Yeah.
But also looking at, not just the surface issues, but what are the structural issues. And I think this is the importance of also going back to what I said earlier on the knowledge of history. And when one understands the history and the dynamics, so not just looking at the surface issues of a conflict. And, this is one thing which, where he has contributed, to peace processes. This is an element which he has really, brought to the fore in terms of then how do you have sustainable peace. These are the underlying structural issues, which need to be taken into account, and also, bringing in, other voices as well and constituents.
Let's talk about your mom as well.
Yeah.
So your dad was Kenyan, your mom is from Madagascar, and I know you've visited Madagascar. You've not stayed, you've not lived there.
No,
But you're very clear on identifying as half Kenyan and half Malagasy. And mothers are influential. Do you sometimes go consult your mom in the absence of your dad? You say, maybe I'll not go to, dad is not here, but mom is going to play that role and she'll play it very well. I want you to speak to the Malagasy influence on your life.
Very strong, as you say, I do identify as Malagasy and Kenyan. Okay. Traditionally in Madagascar, we're matriarchal. So, also, I grew up with a sense of you know, if you're capable of doing something, you can do it. There
Yeah.
wasn't a sense of, let's say, male roles.
Man, this
and
is for boys, this
female
is for
roles.
girls. No.
Not at all. You know, currently my mother is the head of the family. I mean, her parents are, you know, deceased. Even in the Malagasy community in Kenya, she is treated as an elder. She's the Rayamandren, which is like a respected, you know, person as the elder of the community. So definitely, you know, not having these senses of, you know, male roles, female roles. And my parents were partners, 100%. They were partners. That definitely has influenced, you know, my view. You know, I would say. I think also growing up not only in a household with two cultures, but also as a child living in other places. I think there's always been an openness of new experiences, meeting new people, trying, you know, different things. And they were both, they both traveled a lot, you know, for work. They were both, you know, very open. So it was, I would say, an experience which probably prepared me very well, if I look back, you know, in terms of, you know, doing the work that I do now, and also in terms of my own travel, you know, and experiences. So it was.
I can imagine having
yes.
traveled and being exposed at that young age.
Yes.
And today you sit in that position, traveling and serving different communities.
Indeed.
Yeah, you needed to have such a strong background. When you look back at what you've achieved so far and what the future holds for you, what would you say to the 25-year-old Nirina? I wonder where you were at that time. Where were you between 20 to 25?
25. I think I was finishing my master's degree at 25, I recall. Well, I would actually say the same thing my parents said to me. And I mean, they both lived, you know, when my mother continues to live a life of service. And that is always, you know, very foundational, you know, within our family is, you know, live a life of service, live a life of purpose. And so I would reiterate those words to my 25-year-old self.
If you weren't in governance and peace building, what would you be doing?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, to be honest, I am extremely passionate about the work that I do. And I think in some way I would still be doing something related to this field of work. And bringing it in because it's not something which I just see as a job. It is something which I deeply believe in, which is worthwhile to invest one's, you know, time, you know, energy, whatever one can contribute. So I do think I would be doing something related.
The same. You know, Matthias and Andrew talked about hope. Yes. Sometimes we have a tendency to lose hope, give up. And the kind of work that you do could take you very many steps forward and then very many steps backward. You are there talking to someone, you think they've accepted what you're saying, then they go into another room and come back with a different perspective. I wonder what keeps you going, what keeps you motivated, what keeps you hopeful that tomorrow will be a better day for this continent?
Working in development, it's a long journey. Working on issues of governance, working on peace building. I mean, these are all areas that take time to build, to develop. And I think one element is then when you look back, you know, across time, you can then tangibly see what was the impact or what were the results from, you know, this journey of governance, I would say. Is there backsliding that happens sometimes? You know, yes. But I think in the totality of time, you know, one can also see what were the gains that were there. So I think an element of overall perspective is important, and the sense of time. You know, for when we are doing monitoring, you know, of projects, we also look at where is there incremental change. We have a certain overall result, but how do we measure the steps towards that overall,
result.
Working in this field, I would say at a personal level, while you do see challenges, you also see people, organizations, institutions committed to working on improving things, for really having people-centered development at the core. And so I think one is in an interesting place of the point of balance between seeing, all right, these are the challenges to address or opportunities we want to leverage upon, but there's a lot of commitment that's there, and I think that is also encouraging, also from a perspective, point of view.
So on a bad day, you will look at the communities and the things they're celebrating. That's where your strength will come from.
Indeed.
Yeah. This should be my last question. We have a recession in democracy. This is affecting the globe. I wonder, from where you sit, what would you say is that approach that the continent needs to embrace today in order to strengthen governance and help us get to where we want to get as a people?
There have been a lot of discussions over several years in terms of looking at democratic principles, looking at good governance. What does that look like? And I think what is important is seeing, what do we need to measure? What type of indicators are we looking at? And when we're looking at the indicators, it's important to look at some of what we can call soft indicators. When you look at the recession, what you also see is a reduction in trust, a fraying of the social contract between state and citizens is one of the effects. So when you're looking at, then addressing this, you also need to examine what are ways to strengthen the social contract at the national level with communities who are really feeling this gap, and one can say also in some context the youth feeling this gap. So I would say that it's looking at it quite holistically. As UNDP, governance we take as both a pillar and an enabler. So looking at core elements of governance, be it institutions, looking at elections, civic engagement, and then when you look at governance as an enabler, and I think I've hinted at this a bit, when we look at fiscal health, economic governance, transparency, issues, enabling environments for inclusion, what kind of policies can be put in place. So very much at a national level, these are the components and the approaches we take of governance as a core pillar and really foundational to sustainable development, and then also leveraging on governance. We had an interesting dialogue, again on the sidelines of the African Union Summit, looking at transformative governance and looking at issues of mindset, and really what is our vision for Africa. And I think one element which came out, which was quite interesting in the discussion, is also ideology. And for the continent, also having more of common purpose. And this, really came out. How do we, work together on
because we seem to be quite scattered,
on our common priorities. I mean, some are articulated, quite clearly, but are we really making these a reality?
Are we journeying together?
Yes, and leveraging also, on these elements which can actually strengthen us, strengthen us together. So, looking at these different components, I would say both, national level and, at regional level, and, being able to strengthen the work on really good governance.
Sometimes the young people, especially the youth, feel disenfranchised, they feel unincluded. And as a result, you'll find them in conversation saying, government is not for me, governance is not for me. What would you say to such a person who thinks they cannot play a role in governance? Because they think, maybe I'm just down there. In this chain, I'm at the bottom.
It is important for everyone to feel as part of a society that they can participate. The question then becomes, are there platforms that they can engage in or processes that they can engage in? So one of the processes which are supported in certain contexts are also looking at let's say inclusive dialogue platforms on, let's say, development within one's own community. The element of inclusion is extremely important, and when we look at why those who feel disenfranchised, disconnected, people who from our studies we see who have been vulnerable to joining, let's say, violent extremist groups.
Yeah.
One of the issues that come out is this lack of feeling included within a society. So really investing, I would say, at the local level, whereby the youth also feel they have a voice.
Yeah.
They feel they're able to participate. There are different ways of doing this, and now we're seeing also different types of tools in terms of ensuring more participation, say from the local level into even national processes, consultations. So really trying to have an empowered and informed citizenry, and that really creates a shift, I would say, in terms of this perception of or sentiment of feeling quite disconnected.
They don't matter. If there was one message you'd want our viewer to take from this conversation, that key message you want to leave them with, what would that be?
Well, it's a tricky question.
If they want to forget everything you have said, what is it you do not want them to forget?
Well, maybe one message, and perhaps it links with your last question, when we look at governance in particular, that participation is important. Participation is very important. And there might be challenges, there are problems, but these are our problems. We must own them. And when we have a feeling of ownership, of challenges, then we are invested in solving them.
That's right.
So I think it's really the element of, again, that engagement, participation within these spaces.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time, Nirina. This has been a powerful conversation, and we look forward to having you back here.
Thank you very much for having me, Jackie.
My pleasure. It is my hope that this conversation has left you thinking, pondering. If you are at that point where you're saying, my government is not serving me and I am done, I hope that you will get rejuvenated. We are not giving up. We remain hopeful and optimistic. Our guest today was Nirina Kiplagat. She's the Governance and Peacebuilding Coordinator at the UNDP Regional Center for Africa. And it's been such an honor to bring this conversation to you. We thank Mythos Boutique Hotel for hosting us, and we're looking forward to seeing you next week. God bless you.